Okay, I think we'll start. Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome everyone to the next in the detail webinar celebrating our RIAS Special Category Award winners 2026. The projects were judged by myself alongside Owen Hopkins, Eliazet, and Anna Liu, shortlisting 14 buildings, award-winning 10 and a further 5 special award winners. This is the third of the detail series, and please head to the RIS events page if you would like to sign up for the next 2 weeks of Wednesday webinars. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be available on your YouTube shortly after. You can already catch up with our first 2 sessions in this way. This week we are joined by Colin Baillie from Baillie & Baillie Architects, who will be giving us an insight into the fantastic Iorram. I will introduce Colin more fully a little later on, and as well as the RIAS Award, Iorram was also the deserving winner of the CTI Timber Award and the Luths Services Sustainability Award. We are delighted to be joined by both of our sponsors, and I would firstly like to introduce Dan Gates. Dan Gates is a director of Luths Services and a chartered engineer with expertise in mechanical heating, ventilation, plumbing, and renewable energy services. He is a CIBSE low carbon consultant, passive house designer, dynamic energy modeler, and a retrofit coordinator, with a particular interest in retrofit and heat pump technologies. Dan, please introduce us to Luths.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's just a short introduction, and we're delighted to support the Sustainability Award with RIAS and again with Colin's project. We're fantastic to see an award winner. We're not part of the judging panel, and there's a lot of high quality entries, and everyone's interested in sustainability. But in Luths, we're Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Inverness. We do domestic and commercial, so we can operate on very small projects. And again, part of our ethos is as environmentalists ourselves, potentially to even reduce the services out and maybe not have lots of kit in a project. So that's we're delighted to see projects going ahead on that basis as well. But thanks, Chris. That's all from me.
Thank you, Dan. Our second sponsor attending today's session is Andy Leach from the RIS CTI Timber Award. Andy is the Deputy Chief Executive of the Confederation of Forest Industries, the trade body that represents the domestic wood supply chain. He is also a Director of Confederation of Timber Industries and an Honorary Fellow at the RIS. He has over 40 years' experience in the forestry and wood processing sector. The latter half of his career has involved a focus on adding value to homegrown timber. Over the last 15 years, he has actively been involved with Scotland's Housing, Expo, Edinburgh Napier University, BEST, and Architecture, and Design Scotland, sponsoring product development and dissemination in products like homegrown CLT and wood fibre insulation. And he was an active supporter of the materials library at the Lighthouse. Andy, over to you for a brief intro.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, folks, and thank you for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Confederation of Timber Industries and why we support the RIAS Timber Award. As Chris says, I'm Andy Leach. I'm the Deputy Chief Exec of the Confederation of Forest Industries, which is not timber industries, but I make up one of the 3 organisations that make up the CTI. The other 2 are Timber Development UK and the Structural Timber Association. And we get together as organisations to focus on our kind of common messaging. And we represent the majority of businesses involved in the UK wood supply chain, from the timber grown in this country and abroad, the merchants who distribute that timber, and those using it in construction purposes, such as timber framers. Together, we are working with the UK government to deliver the ambitions of the Timber and Construction Roadmap, which, as it says in the tin, aims to increase the use of timber and construction in the UK in order to store more carbon for longer in buildings and to substitute higher embodied energy construction products where possible. In this country, we harvest over 10 million tonnes of timber every year, and in the next 20 years, that's going to increase to 12 million tonnes. So this is very good news for a country that actually imports currently over 80% of the wood products it consumes. So together, the CTI's key messaging to government at the moment is we welcome the challenge to use more timber in construction, and we will do our best to do that. We also support the focus on increasing more use of homegrown timber in construction to reduce that reliance on imports and to support local supply chains. But in order to do this, the government must ensure fair and balanced building regulations that do not create unintentional blockers to safely using wood products. And finally, of course, if the government wants to use more wood, then they have to help us to plant more forests that can actually produce that. To be honest, architects in Scotland have been leading the way for decades in detailing timber not only as a mainstream building material, but using it innovatively and to enhance the external beauty of buildings across Scotland. And that's one of the main reasons that we are sponsoring this award, to celebrate that expertise and that enthusiasm. And this year's winner of the CTI Timber Award, Iorram by Baillie Architects, is another fantastic example of the innovative use of homegrown timber to create a beautiful, warm, modern building that doesn't cost you off. So finally, as I mentioned earlier, the good news is that there's plenty of homegrown timber available for the coming decades, which offers a great opportunity for architects in Scotland to make greater use of this local sustainable building material. It offers a practical route to lower carbon design, supports domestic supply chains, and creates warm, adaptable spaces that people enjoy living in. And if anyone wants to know any more about these topics, please get in touch. We'll be glad. That's all from me, and I will now hand back to Chris. And I hope you have a productive and informative webinar. Anyway, once again, congratulations to Baillie and
Thank you, Andy. That's very, very good. Moving on to the main part of today's webinar, I would now like to introduce our speaker, Colin. Colin is a practicing architect and director of Baillie & Baillie, a small studio building a reputation for their considered approach to materials, resources, and landscape. In a time of unprecedented environmental change, Baillie & Baillie are committed to working with natural materials and progressive approaches to construction. Colin is a member of the RIBA Council, a trustee of Kyle and Lucash Community Trust, where he lives in the Scottish Highlands, and an external examiner at Scots Sutherland School of Architecture. He has taught as a studio tutor at the Strathclyde University and the Dundee University. Before I pass to Colin, a reminder that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, so please use this to submit any of your questions to Colin throughout the session. Over to Colin. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Let me share my screen. Well, thanks, Chris. And I'd just like to start by saying it was a real privilege to have Chris and the other judges up to visit us at Iorram when we were part of the judging process for the RIAS Awards. It was really nice to be able to. Like, one of the great things about the RIAS Awards is that all the buildings are visited in person, and it gives a really great opportunity to get closer to it. And architecture ultimately is about the experience of buildings and spaces. And it's a privilege also to have the opportunity to talk in a little bit more detail about the project. So I'm going to take you through a bit more of the background of our project Iorram and how the project came about, the sort of history of the village and the context in which it sits, as well as a little bit about the structural approach, and construction language of the space, and finally the sort of spatial organisation and kind of character and atmosphere of the building. Firstly, the project is a self-build project. It's our own building, and it really was an opportunity for us to kind of really engage with the process of making and building, not just the process of designing and drawing, but actually the kind of physicality of how things come together. And this is a little book that was given to me by my former colleagues at Hoskins Architects before Megan and I moved up to the Highlands to start building. And this was published in 1925, so it's over 100 years ago. And it was a little nod to us going off to self-build, but also I think interesting because the book sort of embodies this pre-plastic mindset that all architects were sort of working in at that time. So simpler kind of forms of construction that are sort of rooted in essentially in natural materials and also in a much more direct way in craftsmanship. So the little image on the left showing how pan tiles can be used to create a vent. So working in ways that didn't involve directly products.
Colin, we can't see the images.
Okay, I am going to come out of full screen. Let me just do that again. Possibly because I was in full screen mode. You got us, yeah. You seeing changing images, Chris?
Yes, we can now. Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So yeah, sorry, just to catch that up with the image, the image on the left, yeah, just showing this book by Edwin Gunn, For Those Who Build, which is very much about understanding the process of how things come together in a building physically, not just the sort of drawing aspects of building. So yeah, to start with the kind of zoomed out context, this is Plockton. It's the village on the west coast of the Scottish Highlands where my wife Megan and our young family are lucky enough to live. This photograph is taken on the hillside just behind our house where we currently live, and sort of in the middle of the shot you can see Iorram and the context that sits within this kind of quite tight-knit village context, but within this really big landscape. And it is a place, I kind of describe Plockton as a place that sort of occupies an edge because it sits on the west coast of the Scottish Highlands, but faces east, so it's right on the edge of the Hebrides and that kind of fragmented coastal landscape of the Hebridean archipelago, but looking back into the inner Highlands. And it's on this sheltered bay, so while it does get battered by the west coast weather, you know, depending on which way the wind's blowing, it's actually a very sheltered harbour. So it's kind of got these sort of extremes. This image was taken by Jim Stevenson when we were up on the hillside taking images of the village, and we saw this kind of rainstorm just moving towards the loch towards us, and really reminded us of how elemental the landscape is. The village of Plockton itself is actually a planned village, so the kind of post Highland clearances era kind of fisheries village, so incentivized by the kind of growing fisheries industry. So there's also a few sort of almost contrasting conditions within the village. The historic plan on the right hand side here is the 1801 sort of formal town plan, which was, I think, drawn in a very top-down way, kind of rational town planning from most likely from afar, because it doesn't really quite reflect the reality of the topography of the village. And you can see on the kind of current figure ground plan on the left how that sort of ribbon of Harbour Street, the kind of principal street through the village, you know, quite closely reflects this kind of formal, you know, front-facing language of the kind of rational town planning, but around the edges it quite quickly starts to fragment and break up into this kind of looser, less sort of formalized condition. These historic photographs kind of articulate that these elements of kind of quite formal, front-facing, symmetrical, fundamentally kind of symmetrical cottages, quite polite language, but then actually once you get a glimpse of backs and kind of edges, there is a bit of a looser hierarchy with sheds, outbuildings, little boffins within the gardens of the primary houses, but then also this kind of varying roofscape that comes with the kind of nature of how the plan was built out, and also the kind of topography of the village, which is very much reflected today. So Harbour Street has this kind of very polite language of dormers and kind of orderly fronts, but around the peripheries where our site sits, it quite quickly starts to break down into some really quite informal and kind of like quite characterful smaller buildings made of less, and maybe in a less precious way, with corrugate materials, and kind of, I guess, less sort of direct frontality in how they're composed. So this is the sort of end of kind of quite an iconic image of Plockton, the end of the promontory, which Iorram is situated, and kind of found these conditions quite interesting, where the sort of front-facing ribbon of the principal street breaks down into kind of more sculptural, slightly kind of heavier object-like buildings, which I think kind of are, again, sort of rooted in the landscape, despite being quite geometric and kind of contrasting in terms of their materials. Something about the project that we haven't sort of talked much about previously or shared is that it's actually part of a kind of wider development that Megan and I are pursuing. So the plot itself, Iorram is kind of phase one of what we are intending to do in the village. So Iorram down at the bottom of this kind of teardrop shaped site really belongs to that sort of looser language of individual buildings. And then the phase two, which we're looking forward to kind of bringing forward in the near future, belongs a lot more closely to this kind of language of a consistent street edge. So really the site is kind of important to contextualize Iorram in the kind of wider, in terms of the wider village, but also just the site that it occupies, and the kind of future development of that, which is really about a kind of house, a cottage, which is like a little sibling to the principal house, and a garden that kind of unifies those. And then also the kind of boundary conditions and the sort of edges that we're using to sort of define and really knit the buildings into the site. I think simplicity is something that is kind of a real ethos within the practice, and sometimes it takes a wee while to get there. And when we first started looking at the project, the context and the site, we probably started from a place that was maybe looking a bit more adventurously around aspects like form and the kind of like sculptural object, and we just, like we do with a lot of our projects, I think gradually started to let more and more of that go and pare it back to something which we could become quite comfortable with just being formally simple, and really kind of engaging with actually how the building's put together and the kind of the character within those quite sort of simple rules. So we the process was really one of sort of paring back. As you saw in the plan, it's quite an unusual shape. It doesn't quite fit into that as the original town plan, where with these very kind of geometric rectilinear plots, it has this curved edge. So the buildings are sort of situated to reflect that and address streets, but also kind of acknowledging that fronts and backs are quite prominent. We're dealing with a corner. We're dealing with these kind of longer vistas. The very first image I showed, where from the other side of the loch, the position of Iorram is really quite visible and legible. So kind of addressing this variety of conditions within the plot. And I guess the village, the context of the village is particularly important as well, that all of the buildings are grounded, have an immediate kind of surrounding with quite a rich language of gardens and stone boundary walls and hedges. So that was really quite a fundamental part of the design process. So Iorram sits within this triangular part of the kind of lower portion of the plot. The building is orientated east, southeast towards the view and reflecting the angle of the street. And while it sits in, sort of by necessity, occupying this, kind of central position within quite a small plot, we wanted to use the landscape features, the stone walls, and kind of actually manipulating the levels on the plot at the bottom, sort of southern edge of the plot to kind of to address that very narrow boundary. We created a stone wall and built up a big planting bed to kind of create these pockets of space around the building. So while the building sits quite centrally, we've created these little gardens that each have kind of a unique aspect defined by the building, and using the edges to kind of make those habitable and make those kind of make sense around the building. And using, I think within the landscaping, there was an idea quite early on that the landscape should be something like completely other from the building. So the building has this kind of geometry and slight sort of austerity that we kind of observe in some of the quite hard vernacular buildings, but that the landscape can belong to a different language and deliberately be quite sort of rustic and contrasting, and that kind of rooted in this idea of a cottage and its garden. And then, as I mentioned, the long views and these kind of vistas that you get from this sort of shoreline as you kind of walk along the beach, or also from boats. It's a kind of prominent harbour throughout the summer. This photo was taken in winter when the bay is empty, and in the summer there's probably 60, 70 yachts park in the bay, drop anchor in the bay. So it's also quite an important approach. And then looking back out to where that initial photograph was taken, on the hillside across the bay. So to structure, language and construction, it's something we became very interested in when we were developing the project. Plockton is a conservation area, and it's quite a strict conservation area. There are not many conservation villages within the Highlands, and so one of the starting points for the project was this expectation that you have to sort of fit in, and there is this quite maybe conservative language around conservation. And I guess in a way we didn't really see that as being problematic, but we wanted to ensure that whatever we built would have a kind of authenticity with the vernacular language of the village, and not be sort of representational of the architecture that the conservation area seeks to protect. And that was really something that we saw being rooted in how the building is constructed. So not necessarily looking at historic buildings in the village and inherently in terms of their language, but in terms of why they look the way they look, which is derived from how they're constructed and the materials that are available. So these kind of very deep masonry walls with contrastingly lightweight inserted timber structures that are often visible internally and made with quite crude, locally sourced materials. So sourcing of materials was an early interest, and we wanted to look at whether we could make the project entirely with natural materials, and where possible local materials. So the sourcing of Scottish timber was something that we started to explore, and we wanted to use. It was important to us to use these materials not for finishes, and not just for finishes, and not just for the sort of surfaces that you engage with, but actually in the bones of the building. So to make the structural elements entirely out of Scottish sourced timber, as well as the kind of more refined finishing elements. And I'll maybe come back to this point a little bit later, but I guess just one of the things that we engage with the process of how the timber is actually sourced and produced. And that's one of the great things I think about working with homegrown timber, is that there's this extremely kind of clear provenance from where the material is sustainably sourced, and how it's produced, what happens to the waste, being able to talk directly to the sawmill about the specification that you need, what kind of timber's appropriate for any specific job, something that you can get really kind of quite deeply involved with. But then also on the other side of that, the constraints that come with working with Scottish timber. And I think that was something that we were quite keen to engage with. I feel that a lot of materials, and particularly timber that we use in construction, are almost over-specified. They're specified for perfection, and they're specified to ensure no movement whatsoever, and minimizing knots. And I think actually there's a bit of an opportunity in the imperfections that you get with working with homegrown timber. And I guess just trying to detach from this idea about sort of visual perfection, and actually start with the material itself and think what it can do, and how it looks, and actually find a place for that in the project, rather than I guess having to sort of source material from the other side of the world purely because it was unacceptable to have more than one or two felled knots in a piece of timber. And actually knots are part of the material, and movement is part of working with something natural like timber. Buildings change over time. That I think that's part of the kind of beauty and joy of historic buildings. One of the other things that we were really engaged with as self-builders of the project was sort of having to take responsibility for everything within the project. So we set out every single block. We built the walls out of load-bearing clay block system, thermal clay block system, which effectively creates this load-bearing shell. And the timber structures were then effectively built within that. So the shell is completed in its entirety first. The majority of the scaffolding came down at that point, and then we sort of worked from within the building and placed this roof structure and the internal walls. So I think it's also one of the nice things about working at a small scale, which this project gave us the opportunity to do, to really know the building inside out, to know every part. We knew we had to work out, we ordered the fixings ourselves, we ordered all the materials ourselves. So we had to kind of make this model, this 3D model, in a way that would kind of quantify and allow us to understand every single component, which was actually also, a really good way to minimize waste through the construction process. Working with natural materials inherently reduces waste, because the materials have uses beyond landfill. And obviously with timber, there are kind of many uses for offcuts, and we managed to firstly quantify everything down to quite a kind of fine level of accuracy, and then secondly in the case of timber, to repurpose offcuts for joinery elements and other aspects of the interior of the project, which I'll show in a few slides time. And then with the clay block, it's there were no plastics, no membranes. It's a kind of single material building product. So you can see in the image on the right, these sort of cuts or offcuts from the verge, where we sort of place this timber board and then effectively just cut on an angle the excess areas of block, and they can just be crushed down. We use them as a sort of permeable substrate to our paving. Nothing, very, very little needed to be removed from site, which is obviously beneficial from a sustainability perspective, but also construction logistics, where we're working in the Highlands. It's actually very hard to take things away from site, and it can become quite a challenge on larger projects. So the building is effectively extremely simple. It's a clay block wall construction, a timber roof construction, timber-based wood fibre board insulation on top of the structure, and I'll show you that detail a little bit further into the presentation. And then for the surfaces of the walls, we used natural lime harling with quite a coarse aggregate on the outside of the building, and then in the internal faces, this is the image on the right, shows the clay base coat that we used, which was a mixture of UK sourced clay and hemp fibres. So it provides a kind of sort of thick base coat that is also the parge coat for the blocks, so creates the airtightness layer, again, without using any membranes. And then we used that as a kind of rough finish to take the smoother natural clay top coat. It was quite a nice moment in the project and did make us wonder whether we ought to have kind of, gone for a sort of darker colour of plaster, because it was something quite sort of cocooning about this rich kind of green plaster colour. And the hemp fibres through the clay also provide additional insulation, although we didn't sort of factor that into our U value calculations. There is it creates the small air pockets within the material. The image on the left was from the Scottish Lime Centre. I did a short course at the Scottish Lime Centre on lime harling, and actually undertook all of the harling work myself on the project, which was possibly a bigger task than I initially anticipated. And then I think the last image, and with the internal walls and this external image, I think there's something kind of that the clay, the load-bearing masonry walls provide for the building, which is like a real sense of solidity and mass. And internally, there's sort of little irregularities in the walls, where we ask the plasterer not to sort of build out to square off edges, but to actually follow the contours of the block. So there's a sort of quite a subtle kind of natural undulation to the walls that wouldn't be registered with a sheet material. Everything would be made a lot more kind of crisp and rectilinear. So while the load-bearing elements are effectively finished over, I feel there's a kind of quite a strong legibility of this load-bearing shell. As apart from anything else, there are no movement joints, there are no weak vents in the construction, so it does have this sort of mass and solidity that a historic masonry building has. And then against that mass, we were kind of enjoyed exploring the thinness of corrugated metal as a material. So kind of pushing this chimney back to align with the ridge to create a kind of real sense of weight in that gable, which faces into the kind of prevailing weather. But to try and expose the edge of the roof in its kind of millimetre thinness as this kind of blade-like element that sits atop the much heavier load-bearing construction. Just to kind of share a detail of that, all of the lintels in the clay block system are made from clay U shells, which are concrete filled. So there's a insulation layer. The clay itself is insulating, which is cross-hatched in the lintel, and then there's a kind of a channel that is filled with reinforced concrete to sort of bind the U shell elements together, which are effectively blocks. It's a bit of a trick in the project because in terms of how we dealt with the insulation, when we wanted to expose the structure both internally in the roof volume, but also externally at the eaves. So they actually sit in slightly different lines. The eaves are cantilevered rafters which sit on top of the primary rafters, and they are kind of nail plated on, bracketed onto the primary rafters, and then filled with clay blocks between. So the insulation actually sits, wood fibre insulation sits within the flying rafter line rather than the internal structural line. Kind of don't necessarily perceive in reality that the two sit on a slightly different plane. And on the internal leaf, we kind of created a service zone with how the rafters come down and sit onto the wall head and the lintels. So we were able to kind of run services down across the eaves, and then through the clay block, the conduit is just actually raggled in. It's very similar to a historic building. And then on offcuts and waste, we made the internal doors. These are just a couple of images from on site. We made the internal doors from sort of plain down offcuts of joists, using really kind of traditional methods of craftsmanship. The kitchen itself was made also with offcuts, and it was important for us to kind of take that use of the material right through the carpentry elements as well, and not just kind of make Douglas fir doors on plywood carcasses. We wanted to make this like a piece of furniture, so the whole thing was made as a bench and kind of set into the space. And so the insides of the cupboards and everything are made out of jointed Douglas fir boards. And then just in terms of the organisation and the kind of character of the building, we are working with a very small amount of space. The plan is only 38 metres squared, and I think one of the things that we wanted to achieve with how the building feels is to, I guess, try and bring a sense of generosity to that quite small footprint. So while the plan, I think, is essentially quite simple, there are sort of several little devices that we employed to try and give the interior a sense of richness and kind of space. And there's just 6 apertures, so we're quite careful about having one opening per elevation, which gives the really kind of lends that sense of weight and mass to the character of the building. And then there are 2 roof lights, which are very carefully placed to supplement where the apertures in the facades are formed. And then on the gable, where we looked at that offset chimney, a kind of deep hearth that really grounds the kind of orientates the principal room. So spatially, we have created some spaces with a kind of joist ceiling. So there's a little attic space above the bedroom and the entry hall and part of the bathroom, and where we were quite keen to ensure there was a view right through the building and out. So there's that sense of kind of volume, but also compression within the spaces. And then the long section shows how the roof lights are placed, which is a detail which is quite hard to photograph within the kind of close quarters of the building. But we used almost a conservation type steel framed roof light, which sits on top of the rafters and insulation zone so that you don't read any frame at all from the inside of the building. And we set the rafters out very carefully around the dimensions of the roof light, so we could achieve a kind of even spacing across the section of the building and have these roof lights sort of exactly where we wanted them to be placed to illuminate and kind of enliven the section. And so on the left towards the north gable, that kind of view through the building into this panelled in bath, which then has a little double height space above it and is completely top lit, with a sort of frameless roof light that marries up exactly to the rafters. I think is something that we thought was quite successful. It feels kind of like it gives a very simple plan, a sort of spatial richness and kind of elevates it. The principal volume gets the full height of the structure, and you can see it in the top left, the roof light, which sits above the insulation zone and exactly on top of the rafter. In the centre of the plan as well, there's this quite chunky column which kind of anchors the kitchen, and a big deep beam that runs right across, which was 200mm wide and about 300mm deep and 250mm deep. So a really sort of big chunky section that we brought in through kind of on its end through the door, and managed to just quite carefully place that up on the ring beam. And the roof light detail I mentioned. Just maybe to catch on the just below the roof light where the beam sits, we kind of notch the ends of the beams and notch the wall plate, so we could try and get timber to timber connection with the wall plate, which is resin anchor fixed into the clay block. And from the kitchen sink, this sort of little view through behind the column, kind of detaching the column from the kitchen unit, to give this sort of little glimpse through into the hall, and just these kind of small devices that I think add a little bit of kind of generosity and richness to the plan. The fireplace hearth was quite a central sort of idea or feature of the space, and again kind of speaks to the language of the kind of rural cottage, and we wanted to kind of create this oversized opening that we kind of feel is quite an important feature of these kind of rural interiors. And we used an off-the-shelf concrete lintel that had this kind of just roughness and kind of inherent character that we just exposed, so not a fair face, just a standard off-the-shelf Robesley position, slightly proud of the clay block so we could plaster up against it. I haven't mentioned the floors, which were made from natural terracotta tiles, and again these were specified to, we wanted to find something that would have a kind of natural quality and almost a kind of ageless quality. So these are just wood-fired terracotta, which are finished with several coats of linseed oil to create a seal, and then polished with beeswax-based sealant, which kind of really brings out all the kind of rough character and the kind of inherent like imperfections of the material. And we wanted to I guess really create an interior that feels sort of hospitable to objects and pieces of furniture of different kind of ages and character, not something that feels sort of overly refined and kind of pristine. And I think this idea of a kind of rural and slightly kind of rustic quality was something we really wanted to capture. And then obviously the real sense of natural materials. Something that you'll never get from the images, but the kind of combination of Douglas fir, sort of linseed oil and clay plaster has quite a distinct sort of natural sort of aroma that you wouldn't get in a modern buildings, but particularly one with petrochemical based insulations. There's a real, and a lot of people comment on it when they come into the building, and it's a couple of years after completion almost, and it's sort of still there. You can feel it as a natural space. I'll just finish on these images from the shoreline and from the street.
Thank you, Colin. That is a wonderful presentation, an amazing insight into the project, all of which the jury had thoroughly enjoyed, of course, when we visited it. We now have time, a short amount of time, we're at 1:15, for some Q&A. And I'm not sure, Joe, if I can't see any questions, but perhaps you could.
See if you click on the more button, I think you should be able to see there's two Q&A in the box.
Ah, yes. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, I've got one question, well, two questions from David Strathy. Was your contractor familiar with the clay blocks used before the project, and was there any resistance to using them?
It's a good question, David. So our contractor was not familiar with the blocks. We have worked with, we have used the same system with other contractors who have been familiar with them. I think resistance, No, I think it is something that you can quite often come up against in the Scottish construction industry. We used local trades for the project, pretty much entirely local trades, and they were quite open-minded and quite engaged with using things that they hadn't worked with before. The blocks do not require any specific skills that an ordinary brickie doesn't already possess. They do require a kind of higher level of accuracy than normal in the underbuild. It needs to be sort of laser level, but once the initial courses are level, they're actually quite easy to work with. There's another question that I can see there from David.
Yes.
It's maybe
Yeah. Please just jump onto it. Yeah.
picking that up as well. Yeah. And so because so the next question is from David is commented on the simplicity of the construction and asked whether the lack of layers in the build-up resulted in less labour and therefore less construction cost. I think that in theory is the case with porotherm blocks. Certainly in other parts of the UK where concrete blocks are very prevalent, I think there is a very genuine construction efficiency with clay blocks. I do think in Scotland we work on projects we work on a number of timber frame projects as well. Whether it has a time saving over timber frame, I'm not sure. I'd suggest probably not. And one of the challenges that it does present working in exposed locations like the Scottish Highlands is it's a wet trade. So you do get more kind of weather call-offs. Generally, the simplicity of this construction, the theory of the simplicity of the construction, I would say, was borne out in the project. It is simple, satisfyingly so, and the kind of when the walls are constructed, although they maybe take slightly longer to construct than timber frame, which then has all the sundry items and layers of insulation added. Once it's up, it's up. It's quite a quick process to then you have an insulated superstructure as soon as the blocks are erected. So yeah, I'd say there are some pros and cons, but it's I think a really interestingly simple way to build, and something we do again.
Thank you, Colin. There's a few more questions coming in, so we should probably answer them. Can you say something about the ground floor construction of the house from Colin Anderson?
Sure. The ground floor construction at Iorram is quite conventional. We have a block underbuild and a ground bearing slab. We have worked on a number of other projects with glass rock and geotextile underbuilds. This project was in an extremely wet and boggy site, so we kind of ruled out anything other than a kind of non-breathable subfloor. And having explored a variety of different substructure solutions, looking at lower carbon methods, I think for this project that ultimately was the kind of right way to go. One of the things that we're always conscious of when we build is longevity, durability, and we always need to be careful, I think, that you make decisions for the right reasons, and that the decisions that you make around embodied carbon support the subsequent decisions, that you don't make a decision that jeopardizes the kind of longevity of this kind of subsequent layer of construction. So yeah, we've kind of felt restricted because of the ground conditions to a fairly ordinary underbuild, and yeah, that's kind of something that I feel was the right call in this case.
Leading on from that, there was a lot of questions about the construction here. What is the thermal mass of this type of construction?
I mean, thermal mass is really one of the principal reasons to make a masonry structure like this, a thermally insulated masonry structure. The material manufacturers publish quite a lot about thermal mass. We used a block from Duo Block, if anyone wants to look that up. Porotherm is a equivalent system, effectively. having operated the building and being able to use the building for almost 2 years, I really do kind of see the benefit of the thermal mass that the construction brings. It's quite a stable internal temperature, and it's really resistant to the kind of peak highs and lows that you maybe get even with a well insulated lighter weight form of construction. So we find that when in the rare occasion that we do get quite hot summer days, where we are, the temperature is very stable. Yes, you can walk inside and actually feel it's several degrees cooler inside than outside without actually having taken much care with arch ventilation and opening windows overnight. So also like wood fibre board that we used in the roof construction also has quite good thermal mass, not so much as the blocks, but the fact that all sits above the structure continuously. The building has quite a kind of quite a thick and sort of thermally massive envelope. Yeah, and I think it's you can feel it in the building.
Yeah, nice. Well, one more question here from an anonymous person. What is the timescale and cost construction, noting, of course, that it was largely self-built?
The self-build, anyone who's embarked on a self-build will know has a negative implication on timescale, where maybe it has a positive implication on construction cost. This was very much our sort of own pet project, and we had I think a 6-month-old baby when we started, and by the time we finished, we had almost another 6-month-old baby. So it took a couple of years. But although it could have been done quite a lot quicker, that was to do with the nature of self-building with kind of a busy life and a young family. The construction cost, we have kind of previously published figures on construction costs. The build cost for the entire project was just over £200,000. However, there were quite a lot of site costs within that, and as I noted in the presentation, we're looking to start building our own house on the plot as well, and some of those costs will be shared with the house build. So services, access, landscaping and so on, which is another aspect of building in the village. I think that we actually also took the landscaping quite far, quite early on so the project runs beyond just the limitations of the walls. Maybe in a kind of more kind of landscape-based site there would be less need for that, but and like finishing the landscape to a high standard, we really felt, and the garden was really part of the project. So that sort of includes those costs as well. And the project was a self-build, but it was self-project managed. We were involved in every aspect of the build. We sort of hands-on labour were involved in some aspects of the build, but not all. So we did work with plumbers, electricians. We had joiners involved, and we were sort of directly on site project managing, but not entirely our own labour. It's kind of important to say as well.
You might just mention something about how the building is heated as well. I mean, that's a question that perhaps others might have quite.
Yeah, so the building is being so small, we wanted to kind of use a real sort of simple and first principles approach to the heating. We use a simple electric boiler, and it feeds a heat battery, which is a Sunamp Thermino heat battery, which is kind of really kind of great space efficient way to increase the efficiency of an electric boiler. Electric boilers are 100% efficient, as I understand it, but the conversion from electricity to heating water allows us to not need to heat a tank of water, and kind of allows us to to sort of store heat more efficiently and heat up water effectively at point of source, which is Dan's on the call. He's probably shaking his head. I don't understand exactly the sort of mechanics of the heat battery, but it's yeah, I just a really kind of simple and effective way to use clean electric heating. It's also underfloor heating, so the electric boiler heats the underfloor heating, which is cast into the slab below the tiles.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't think we have any more questions on the board. One question that comes to mind, if I might ask, as chairs, how the buildings in the town have been extended over time, and do you see the potential for either of your projects to be extended in a similar way over time and adapted?
It's a good question. I think in a way our plot is inherently sort of quite restrictive
Yeah.
for where you know, a lot, I think by the virtue of the original town plan in Plockton, there's a really clear sense of backs in the village, a real clear sense of fronts and backs. So you have this condition where the fronts are all very precious and the backs are sort of anything goes almost, you know.
Yes, yes.
So you really get this heterogeneity around the backs of buildings, but our plot is slightly different from that, where the corner is such that the you know, it almost has a double front to where our house will be positioned. So
Yeah.
I would like to think it won't be, because you know, in a way that
Not sure how, yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, there are always interesting ways, I think, to
Yeah.
add to what is built. So yeah, be interesting to see in the future.
Well, thank you, Colin. It's a really, really inspiring talk. This concludes today's in detail session, and once again, thank you for giving up your time today, Colin, and everyone else for coming along and supporting the event. Please look out for the recording uploaded onto the RIAS YouTube. And next week we have Ian Fraser along to speak out about the Isle of Canna House project, winner of the RIAS Velux Architecture Heritage Award. We hope these sessions will encourage learning and others to submit buildings to the awards panel next year. So thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.